Okay, here we are. I hope you have your beverage handy. Well, here we are with the 28th episode of What is Truth, and I'm not quite sure we've got there yet. We're getting closer, but it's like a Fibonacci series, and the farther you go, the deeper it gets. And so today we're here with the co-host, Reverend David William Parry from merry old England, the city of London, not the square mile. And today I thought we'd just kind of shoot from the hip. And so, of course, we don't have any weapons. That's a figure of speech. And I think today figures of speech are becoming more and more prevalent because people are kind of aghast. They're kind of wondering, how do we get to this point? And my thesis has been for 40 years that it's intentional and that there are people that just love power and they can't help it. And so I've been sharing quite a bit of content and pointing out things within the work of Rudolf Steiner that shows that there's an underbelly to human culture that keeps rearing its head, and that's a head perhaps covered with scales, as David Icke would like to comment. But there's this whole idea of there's a struggle that's going on between the dragon and the dove. And we like to think that we're on the side of the dove, but being merely human, we, like everybody else out there, for the most part, continue our daily struggles with the indifference of Lucifer and the power-grabbing surges of Ahriman. And so here we are trying to find the middle. And that's why I thought it'd be great to do a series with Reverend David, because number one, he lets me talk, and that's a mutual quality I like to think we share. And so seeing as how we both tend to live in large concepts, it's hard to cover it in a meme correctly. And so it's nice to be able to finish the thought, even if it does digress down many and manifold rabbit holes. But that being said, my approach, as people know, is spiritual science of Dr. Rudolf Steiner. That's become my main source of inspiration after many years of seeking. I was the editor of the largest esoteric bookshop in the world, the Mayflower Bookshop here near Detroit. It's also the largest holistic bookstore. And through all those years, I was able to meet many authors and spiritual teachers and gurus and ministers and philosophers and scientists and all of that. And I would avidly try to figure out what they thought they meant, rather than what I think they mean, which is one of the biggest problems going on today. Is people are telling you what they think you mean when it isn't what you mean at all. And so there's a breakdown in communication. But that's a methodology that has been used quite effectively over the last couple of centuries specifically, but long before that. History is written by conquerors, everybody knows that, or at least they should by now. And we've been subjects of presentation of history that on one level defies description because it's so intentionally building concepts and these mental constructs that give you a belief system that you think covers all the avenues that are being expressed. But the actual intention is to shine a light away from certain forces that work in the world. And so that's something that is a spiritual struggle. And that's why we try to emphasize that struggle, because the way to deal with this most effectively is to find a place within your own path to where you can resolve it within your own being. Because if you haven't worked on it there, why should you expect the world to bring you this paradise that you seek? It's like a paradise, like Las Vegas, a paradise. And so, anyways, my co-host here is the Reverend David William Parry. He's the author of The Grammar of Witchcraft, a Shakespearean Study. And as I always say, it's not about witchcraft. And his Shakespearean-esque poetry, Caliban's Redemption, and his principal work that's quite acclaimed about Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts, edited by Daniela Irendust, who's quite a talented young fellow. And those can be found on Amazon. And I have my books, The Arcana of the Grail, Angel, The Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner, The Underground Streams of Esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order. And the sequel to that is The Arcana of Light on the Path. And in these books, I attempt to take the 22-fold structure of the Tree of Life of the Kabbalah, or the 22 autosomal chromosomes of DNA, of normal DNA. And it's interesting because there really is a 22 facet structure to this thing in which we're dwelling, and this construct, so to speak. And what has happened as of late is they've turned up the volume on turning us into space beings, detaching us from a rightful relationship to the realm of time memory. And we're not only space beings, but we're time beings. And the larger your vantage point on time, the more effective is your presence in the world. And so with that, I'll bring in our friend, the Right Reverend David William Parry.
I'm quite happy with just Reverend nowadays, John. I hope you're felicitous. It's always a great pleasure to see you. A friend of mine who I've talked to you about before, Ra Castaldo, asked to be remembered to you and all of our viewers, and he's a fine young man, so I have great pleasure in doing that. What is truth? As a minister, I can answer that really quickly. It is Christ Jesus, period. However, to explain what that means might take at least another 40 or 50 episodes. So, just because you've got the equation, it doesn't mean it's solved. I mean, that's the problem with that. So for me, that question is answered by Jesus being the way, the truth, and the life, which there's no equivocation about, which there's no discussion about, which is simply a God-given statement. There we are. Still a little unhappy with my performance last week. And I don't know what performance this week is going to be like. We just got back from our Valentine's service at Valentine's Hall. We live stream them at the minute. Someone's already managed to say it wasn't clear. Give me a break. I haven't even been back at the house for an hour. Give me a break before the criticism starts. What we're trying to do is be inclusive with a capital I, dear people who said that. Therefore, just because I'm not using the word Jesus in every second sentence, it doesn't mean he's not there. You may have noticed we had something called Holy Communion. Why not look to the end before you start criticizing? Apart from that, my dear friend, oh no, you got me worried about a couple of things last week. I mean, you were mentioning contradictions, and I was meant to say, well, you're actually playing ball in my area of the park as some sort of surrogate Hegelian mystic. I rather like contradictions than antinomies. I rather think they're great fun. And also, I should have said more about that last week, I think. Isn't that the lifeblood of the cosmos, contradictions? Isn't it? It's because those perfect stars at the beginning of creation weren't exactly perfect and collapsed that we're all here. So, hurrah for dialectics. Hurrah for dialectics. You also mentioned James the First, which is the bit really I wanted to address last week and didn't. What a fascinating and contradictory man. Of course, turns up after Elizabeth I with an army just to show that, yes, he is the real ruler, whether people agree with him or not. I know you're into him. Yeah, I know you're into him. I'm sorry, Jacobites are backstabbing bastards. Jacobites are backstabbing bastards. It's in all the dramas of the period. I just think if you show up with an army, there might be something wrong with your claim. It's not me that's making a problem. It's this 100,000 men behind me. So I think there's something to that. And what's a strange guy in some ways. Was he LGBT? I think there's a question mark. I mean, everybody keeps telling me that he was. So I think that's to win me over to a certain side of the argument. But I also have something called discrimination. I like discriminating. Discrimination meaning I like there to be a bit of evidence before I say yes. So for me, there's a question mark. I'm sorry. Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe yes. That's not the bit that interests me. I mean, if you look at some modern pundits, everybody that's ever moved on the face of the planet has been LGBT. I mean, if that's true, nobody is. If everybody is, nobody is. There's a point of logic there. But if everybody's got the same sexuality, then there's nothing to discuss. Although I think there is something to discuss, yada, yada. I mean, a man that talks about witchcraft, and of course wrote a book about witchcraft, but was educated in Holland, which is always a couple of decades at the very least ahead of everybody else in Europe, which is why we hate them. The smug bastards. Yes, you are evolved. Yes, you are enlightened. So stuff you Dutch buggers. Yeah, I mean, all this. So, is it only me that thinks, hang on, there's something of a contradiction there? So you've been to the most enlightened country in Europe and got your education. Then you come back and write a book about witchcraft. Hang on. If ever there was an act of manipulation, that clearly is it. And I remember, and that firm-buttocked Shakespeare who starts writing plays. You may have heard of it, John, about Scottish people where their claim to being king isn't exactly as clear as they'd like. I mean, all that's going on in the background somewhere. So yeah, I don't know. I thought I quite liked our last episode. It was me being ministerial. It was me being pastoral in a way I'm not normally on the show, and I might do a bit more of it. Who knows? Because I've got this. I think we're the perfect dialectic in some ways. That my trouble with the born again mob isn't that they're the born again mob. That is not my trouble. I quite like that bit. My trouble is that being born again for just one too many people means that you cut your brain out and stop thinking. That is not my idea of being born again. I'm sorry. That's my idea of not having a serious conversation with you because nothing can be said. The fact that there are Rudolf Steiners in the world, there are John Barnwells in the world, and there's a wealth of Christian esotericism. I find evocative, I find prayerful, I find a call to meditation, I find a stimulus to deep reading. And maybe when that is being digested on a much more serious level, we can all talk about being born again in a much more serious and significant way. Anyone that can't see esotericism, anyone that can't see Rosicrucianism or anthroposophy as a serious series of steps towards unbelievably profound acts of faith, maybe hasn't understood what the point of esotericism is at all. It's not meant to be a rival. It's meant to be, to my understanding, a very, very, very clear series of strengthenings. They're strengthening faith, they're strengthening spirit. So you can see who is on the cross and why that is the most significant event in human history. On that note, I'll hand back to you, John. On one provisor, you don't think you're going to win me over about the Jacobites. They were swines. They were swines, and that's the end of it. Handing back.
Well, as always, that was more than a mouthful. Regarding the Jacobites, and we shouldn't confuse the Jacobites with the Jacobin. The Jacobin were the nefarious elements of the French Revolution. They were the ones that pulled out the guillotine as a way of solving the debate. And Robespierre and all of his buddies. Anyways, that's not who we're talking about. We're talking about Jacobites. And that is in reference to the line that stems from James I of England, who was a Scottish king and with a lineage that went far back into the mists of time. And he's a fascinating character and somebody that I've spent considerable amount of time on. And it's interesting to note, though, that this conversation about the nature of his sexual proclivities dates back to a biography that was written of him by a man who never met him 60 years later. And it was now in revisionist Jacobite histories, it's accepted that that was merely a political branding, shall we call it, that the best thing that they could do to undermine the king, the previous king, would be to besmirch his reputation through intimations that he was a poofter, that he was a homosexual. But we're one to actually go back and do the digging around like I have done. They'd be satisfied as far as the comments that have been made by his contemporaries, that is, people who actually knew him, as to the deep love between him and his wife, and that they were quite an ideal couple. And he was a great hunter. He was very much into that kind of real macho manly thing that Scotland is so famous for. I mean, remember I've shared with you before when they asked the German officer what was his opinion of British soldiers, and he said, oh, they're good, but those Scots in the dresses. And so they're pretty macho. Sleep out in any kind of weather. They just take their kilt and they wrap it up around them, and it's if you know anything about Scots, they're like the tightly wound version of Britain. And so there's a great contradiction regarding James I, and Rudolf Steiner specifically makes a point. He says there's two completely different views of James I, and they both have a measure of truth. one of his contemporaries was, I believe, a French nobleman. I forget his name right now. I'll dig it up at some other time. I had no idea we were going on a Jacobite parade here, but he referred to him as the wisest fool in Christendom, which is really an interesting statement, especially from a leading French intellectual peer. And so when you start looking into that, you say, okay, who is this guy that presided over the creation of perhaps the most notable publication in history in the English-speaking world, and that is the King James Bible. And it wasn't that he just gave it to a bunch of people to work on, but he was actively involved in discerning what was being said, being that he was conversant in quite a number of disciplines, and including languages. And so he could actually look beneath the hood regarding Greek and also Hebraic aspects of it. And there is some notations of, they'd send him a passage. He asked what he'd think, and he would say, well, and he would make reference to it, making it very clear he knew exactly what he was talking about. And what escapes most people is that the excuse for deposing the Jacobite line was accusations of popishness, that because it had to do with King James I's descendant converting back to Roman Catholicism, which is very problematic when you have a Church of England founded by almost always wholesome Henry VIII. So that there's quite a competition, that the Church of Rome does have this checkered past, perhaps the most checkered past in the history of the Western world, which could be really competed with only by the checkered past of Britain. And so that's two of the leading sources of checkericity, we might call it. But if you look at the project of the King James Bible, you'll see that what he meant to do was include all the various denominations. And then there was these committees of members of all the different dissenting ministers and major figures from the Church of England and all of that, trying to get to the bottom of what would be the ideal way to bring the Bible to the public, which is a new concept, because the Catholic Church didn't want you reading the Bible. They wanted you to hear what they thought you should think it means. And so it was against the law of the church to even have a Bible at one time. So in looking at King James and then looking at his relationship to Emperor Rudolph in his amazing domain in the Austro-Hungarian region there, and you see that he is a leading intellectual figure also. And then you have James I traveling with his queen, Danish queen, by the way, traveling to Denmark and going to Uraniborg, which was the island retreat of Tycho de Brahe, the astronomer, who was remarkable in that he had star globes that he had manufactured by, like, works of art by artisans who normally make jewelry, and that it said that the one globe that he bequeathed to his basic follower was worth more than their whole income for their whole life, right? And of course, that was Kepler, who's considered by many to be the leading figure in astronomy. So you could see in James I a very complex figure. After Queen Elizabeth, he continued the sponsorship of Shakespeare. There was also other artisans that he sponsored, and he really tried to develop the concept of kingship, so that he wrote a book on really one of the central texts for the whole concept of the idea that kings are God chosen was through James I, which of course is an outmoded concept in today's world. And then he wrote his book on demonology and witchcraft and all of that, which is still considered one of the primary texts on the subject. So this is a guy that's got a lot going on beneath the hood. Sponsorship of alchemists, you name it. And so, yeah, he's an interesting figure that I think sheds a lot of light, and it is indicative of the quest of the British identity, and what is that identity, and how does that play in the modern world as far as bringing in elements of truth. And so I always find David's comments interesting because, after all, he is a subject.
I'm getting slow on that mute button. Yeah, I mean, I never forget the fact I'm a subject as opposed to a citizen. If anybody wants to mention the divine right of kings to me, I'll see them outside and they'll get 5 reasons why I think they're wrong. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. Every human being is made equal. It's nonsense. Having said that, oh gosh, where do I begin? No, I don't mind the fact he might have been a puff. As a short, fat puff myself, no, that's neither here nor there. I mean, yeah, that could be used, as far as I remember, at that time period to besmirch, although that was odd in that time period. Or it could be just used to show you weren't sort of at ease within your own skin. I mean, the people have had some bizarre attitudes until recently, but I do believe in progress. I do believe in social and cultural evolution. I think you can see it progressing through the centuries. I believe in scientific evolution. We know a lot now they simply didn't know in the past, and I'd say that's true in the esoteric world. Before there was a Swedenborg and before there was a Rudolf Steiner, these people made massive contributions to the overall forward flow of understanding, of human understanding. I'll never be won over, excuse me, about the Jacobean stuff. I'm thinking of 2 plays at the minute. The Duchess of Malfi. Is there one honest character in that entire play? My God, the Jacobites and Jacobeans united. What a terrible mob. And I'm also thinking of the Revengers tragedy. There's not one good intention in any character or any scenario of that play. So no, Jacobites I don't have much time for. Admittedly, if you look at the Tudors, I mean, okay, they look great when they're riding through the countryside in all these spectacular robes, and all these wonderful horses, and yes, they look great. Yes, they're dictatorial swines, but they look great. And the Jacobeans, they don't even like looking great. There's something wrong if you're looking at them, and there's something wrong if you're not looking at them. Make your minds up. What do you people want? It's all contradictory. I don't like the normalization of duplicity which the Jacobites seem to represent, at least in art and drama. I suspect the art and drama must come to at least a large extent from the cultural milieu they managed to generate. And I can't think of one Jacobite play that I actually like. Because even if you look at sort of Elizabethan plays, and you look at Shakespeare, of course, and if you look at sort of things like Faustus, there are very clear moral boundaries. Marlowe's original Faustus is remarkably moral. The only person Faustus hurts is himself. and he can't see it. The wonderful thing there, he's so clever, he can't actually see that he's been deceived on the most fundamental of levels. It's him that will pay the price for that. I think that's extraordinary. And coming from I don't know what's this. There are right forms of Puritanism and wrong forms of Puritanism. Shallow forms of Puritanism are shocked that someone like Christopher Marlowe, a hellraiser by anybody's description, can write such a moral play as Faustus. Why? Why is anyone surprised at that? I don't get that at all. Yes, he was quite a good man. So yeah, I'm deeply uneasy and suspect of the Jacobites, despite the fact they had a good PR and they had good PR machines. I just think there are one too many tinkling bells in dark closets and skeletons that are refusing to be buried that make me comfortable with all of that. Anyway, I'm uncomfortable with the whole tosh about divine rights of kings, monarchies. Scrap them all, scrap them all. Why do we need monarchies? We need elected presidents. We need assemblies that are accountable to the people. We need bloody sanity in the political progress. I remembered of a scene from The Life of Brian. Yes, I've seen The Life of Brian. Oh my God, I wasn't shocked. I wasn't traumatized. And actually, there are two clear scenes. Do you remember Michael Palin, John, before he became international nice guy, the international gentleman, and when he was a crazed python? I remember him speaking about The Life of Brian at a church I used to visit because they had a wonderful series of lectures. And he was invited to speak about faith and his own views, and he spoke about The Life of Brian, in passing. And he said he couldn't work out why people have been so shocked either. There are two clear scenes of our Lord Christ, two clear scenes. And it's nothing to do with the religious confusion that surrounds Brian. Brian is a misfit and just a confused man. End of story. And it was hilarious. And I remember, I think we've mentioned it on the show before. There's the three wise men turn up and they get the wrong stable and they mistake Brian for the blessed Messiah. And then one of them on the way out, when they've left the holy gifts, realizes they got wrong directions from a local peasant. And they push that woman out the way to get their gifts back. And then you see them in the holy stable. But with the classical Virgin with a halo around her head, and the oxen and the asses looking lovingly at the Saviour. So it's there. And there's another one where you have the Sermon on the Mount, and there's a classical Jesus saying all those wonderful things. And because, of course, it's Python humour, very misunderstood in certain ways, you get to the back of the queue, the people that either arrive late or they couldn't get to the front. And, of course, a row breaks out because that's human nature, where somebody says, "What did he say?" And then somebody else says, "Look, I'm trying to listen." Then somebody else chimes in, "It's something about cheesemakers," because they can't hear, they're so far back. And then somebody else, because it's a human crowd, has decided to lay down the law. Well, what's so special about the cheesemakers then? And it just goes on and on and on. So yeah, I'm sort of sympathetic to all that sort of stuff. Not Jacobites, not Jacobean, sympathetic to progress. All of this, curiously, is reminding me of Martin Heidegger. I'm not sure where that's coming from. I know something flashed into my mind during the week. I find him a very problematic individual, a brilliant philosopher, a man probably not of the most outstanding moral giantism. I mean, his personal teacher was Edmund Husserl. All he had to say to the Gestapo was leave Edmund Husserl alone, which he didn't because he wanted his job. And you think, oh God, that's nasty. And of course, he was a member of the Nazi Party, but that doesn't mean much. If you look back in context, you actually couldn't get a job, any professional job, unless you were a member of the Nazi parties. That doesn't mean anything. But he made a couple of really dodgy speeches when he was alive. And some of his philosophical views, for me, they fit just a little too comfortably into regarding human beings as stock and, just objects that you can do whatever you want with. And that leaves me just a bit uncomfortable. I seem to remember after the war, because he had Jewish friends, his Jewish friends went round to Heidegger's place to have a conversation with him. And he did manage to convince them that he'd been misunderstood. That must have taken some doing to Jewish people directly after World War II. So we've got to sort of keep a question mark there. Maybe that was true. But someone talking about the overall decline, even of spirituality in general. Gosh, is that really what we're facing at the moment? Because that would be the most radical form of dehumanization possible. I mean, that would be something terrifying beyond belief. So yeah, don't like Jacobites, don't like the divine rights of kings. Right. I'll add one more thing, then I'll hand back. Yes, I like Julius Evola. I'm sorry. Yes, I do. I think he's a brilliant writer. No, I don't agree with lots of his points of view. I'm weird. I can read a book and not have to agree with every single thing that's said in it, or the person who wrote it. Isn't that weird? I can think, oh, I don't agree with that. What a shock. But I noticed he said that he too thought that not religion. I think religion is really misunderstood nowadays. I think we all need a lot more of the R word. It's really misunderstood nowadays. But spirituality is the fuel of the R word. And even because spirituality is a human thing, it's not necessarily a religious thing. Even he was saying it's decreasing, but that is terrifying. That's a terrifying, terrifying, terrifying thought. And that's why I don't like, as I say, Jacobites, and I don't like nonsense that I'm better than you and I've got the right to lord it over you because I was born to a particular person. No, I mean, there's something nonsensical in all of that. Growing up in a monarchy, don't forget I grew up in a monarchy, which is why I'm aware I'm a subject, not a citizen. Oh, I only used it once to terrify someone at passport control. They were, how can they be umming and ahhing at me? I look British. I've got a British passport. They're umming and ahhing at me. So I said pompously, as a subject of Her Britannic Majesty, and the Victorian knee-jerk, they instantly let me through. That was good. But it's all nonsense. It's all nonsense. We're all made in God's image. We're all the children of the Most High. No one is put in that position. We're put in positions of a great deal of responsibility sometimes, but I absolutely refuse. I'm with the founding fathers. I'm with all those bloody old Puritans that annoy me so much half the time. There's no such thing as a divine right of kings. It's tosh. Handing back to you, John.
Well, that being said, again, let's be time beings and look at it from a perspective of time. Within the concepts of space that you're referring to, I can wholeheartedly concur. In this particular space in which we're dwelling right now, that is a valid point. This whole idea of divine kingship is very foreign to modern intellect. But if you go back to the works of Rudolf Steiner, and I keep pointing towards 1879, November of 1879, in which in the spiritual war in heaven that had been going on since the 1840s had culminated with the winning, so to speak, of the war in heaven by the hosts of the Archangel Michael. We're in the Michaelic age, and so ultimately what that means is that we're within the time spirit activity of the Archangel Michael. So it's time for a certain modality to come forth. And if you study history, you find that they try to treat history as if it's entirely of human origin. That's their basic premise. And so, in order for it to be entirely of human origin, then it would have to be devoid of content that was inspired by the spiritual world. See? And that's the great misconception, we could say, in terms of what we might call occult history or the hidden side of history that was so clearly delineated in the work of Rudolf Steiner. And so you see that with the winning of the war in heaven in 1879, it was the fall of the spirits of darkness that now are working within the earthly realm, trying to find habitation in the minds of human beings. And that's, I feel, the source of the intuitions that David Icke has made reference to with these lizard people. And it's the Ahrimanic double as being perceived by him, which is quite interesting because he came to it all on his own. I have no awareness of him ever being aware or studied the works of Rudolf Steiner. Maybe he did, I don't know. I'm not sure. But he sure works hard at what he does, and he's been right about a lot of things. As unusual as many of his indications were, when he's on the BBC, he starts making all these prophetic remarks. And then they had to come around years later and say that they had to admit that he was correct, even though at the time they thought he was completely bonkers, as they would say. And so this is what we're looking at to a large extent. And so the what you might call the wholesome spiritual beings cultivated the idea of these family groups and the idea of cultivating groupings under leadership. And that, but Rudolf Steiner made the point that the last initiate on the throne of the emperors was Emperor Charles IV. And that after that, as we move toward the end of the intellectual soul and its forces of abstract thinking, carries it even further when we go to 1412 into 1413, 1414, we enter into the consciousness soul epoch. And in that period, it's intentional that we would come to, at least for a brief period of time, to see ourselves as separate from the spiritual world, so that we could consolidate ourselves as individual beings and not receive all of our inspirations from outside, but be able to be a font of force of the spiritual world from our own being, moving towards the future of Earth evolution, to where we can be active agents in the principle God is love. And ultimately, yes, in getting back to the Christ-centric view of spiritual science, it doesn't exclude other religions, denominations, and all of that. In fact, there are Waldorf schools all over the world. There are Hindu Waldorf schools. There are Islamic Waldorf schools. It takes the vantage point of that it's a good idea to understand what you're talking about when you form an opinion, and to be able to see the Christ revelation as something that consolidated all of the mysteries of Earth evolution into one central source. And when Jesus Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he's not speaking figuratively. And so that's the vantage point of what we would call the true Rosicrucian stream. But in the Rosicrucian stream, rather than go through the sevenfold path of kind of the monastic path, going through the levels of struggle that can ultimately even lead to gaining wounds on your body that approximate the wounds of our Lord on Calvary. That's a very, very difficult path, and very difficult for the average individual today to try and pursue, because it requires, at least for a period of time, a period of isolation to be able to focus one's concentration in a retreat. With the Rosicrucian path, you can just be an ordinary individual, and through the path of study, build in yourself a conceptual world that's capable of bringing into manifestation inspirations from the spiritual world through imagination, inspiration, and intuition, the threefold path of development. And so in being able to come into relationship with an understanding of what a human being is, as far as being a physical being, and then a life body of memories and etheric forces that you share with the plant world, and then an astral body of the desire body that you share with the animal kingdom, but yet the centerpiece of this whole thing that makes you different from all of them is this Christ received I am the I am, that you are, there's an essence of you that you share with our Lord that makes you human in the first place, that was received through the agency of the activities of the second member of the Holy Trinity, the Son. And that's a fundamental characteristic that is a centerpiece, but that's something that's to be approached in perfect freedom. So we don't proselytize regarding that. As far as the fundamentalists you refer to, I think part of the challenge I have with them is that they approach the Bible with abstract thinking in the main. And so it's kind of formulaic and like taking this passage and equating with this other one. And you should have that in your quiver, as far as one of the arrows in your quiver, to be able to meet the mark. But if you get stuck in there, then you'll see that it leads one to abstract thinking is basically a fear-based phenomenological model. And it ties into what's referred to in occultism as kidney thinking. And that's the thinking of Parsifal before he achieves the Grail. That's in the realm of the kidneys, or the reins, as it's translated in the Bible. And you'll see many references to he tried it in his reins, and that there was a certain level of judgment that was being born in the realm of the kidneys. But see, the kidneys is a realm of fear. It's a realm of separation, and that whole idea of the Hegelian thesis antithesis. So that you're a big fan of that, and that is a very, very much a real thing. It's its own realm, but if one raises oneself up to the realm of the heart, then you gain access to a 12-fold scenario that's arising out of the threefold, and it gives you more mobility of thought than just being abstract. And of course, the great representative of abstract thinking, you could see you find it in many different philosophical paths, but nonetheless, John Stuart Mill in Britain, I think, is probably the most developed example. And you shouldn't look at that as being wrong. You should look at it as being incomplete. And that's the real challenge, is to be able to think a thought, like David says, to be able to read an author that you don't agree with, and to be able to understand what he's trying to say and what he thinks he means is the crux of the matter. Instead of just and comment was made to me yesterday. I like when you do shows with David, because you don't always agree. And yeah, that's a good thing. That that creates that dynamic tension, the thesis antithesis, the Hegelian thing. But if you see when Parsifal is in that realm of the kidney thinking, we'll call it, that's the realm of tumfight. That's the realm of dullness. See? And so the path of the Grail, as outlined in the Arcana of the Grail Angel, rising out of the works of Rudolf Steiner, is that Parsifal makes the move from tumfight or dullness into salda or blessedness. And that blessedness is the heart realm, because when one activates one's heart, then one is capable of entering the castle of the Grail, which is the skull. And in the centerpiece in the skull is your pineal and pituitary glands. And that receives, Rudolf Steiner makes the point about the procession of the maidens with all the food, and that represents that there's this cosmic nutrition stream, that there's a relationship that develops between the head and the heart, that's developmental and has to do with the future development of mankind. That it's an objective phenomena, and that one can actively pursue this. Now, this frontal stream can also be found in the esoteric papers of the ES, the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society, in the indications of Madame Blavatsky. And also, Percival mentions it in the Word magazine, but it's something that's in Thinking in Destiny. He develops chapters on that. But in looking at what is this frontal stream, and it has to do with creating a dialogue between the head and the heart. And Rudolf Steiner had said that you observe thoughts with your head, but you perceive the light or darkness of the thought with the heart.
I'm getting much slower with that mute button. It's where I'm tired, I think. Gosh, I mean, certainly Hegel, as a good Lutheran, would never have said human knowledge, human history, the human enterprise is only human. That would never have crossed his mind. People tend to forget more often than not, Hegel spent Sunday having Sunday lunch with his minister. People tend to forget that nowadays. You know, the ultimate scary, annoying professor actually had a human side to him as well, and a very devout side, curiously. You're having a very bad influence on me today, John Barnwell. You've raised another Monty Python moment in my memory, this time from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which everybody went on and on about. And I just thought that, well, perhaps because I'm into Grail mysteries like yourself and Arthurian literature, perhaps it was aimed at the wrong audience in my case. But there's one bit again I loved, curiously starring Michael Palin, featuring Michael Palin, The Clash of Systems, where King Arthur rides up to him and he's a peasant. And I can't remember how the row breaks out, where somebody said, "Well, who made you king then?" To which King Arthur replies, "It was a ceremony with the Lady of the Lake, who gave him the sword, which Excalibur, which is why he has the right to rule the kingdom." To which Michael Palin says, "Supreme executive power must be derived by mandate from the masses, not some, what was it, farcical aquatic ceremony." So a complete clash of systems. I think there was a time, if you go back far enough in ancient Greece, I remember reading Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, which is probably the world's first history book, before there were established upper classes, and before the upper classes could get away with as much as they seem to be getting away with by telling us all that privilege is a natural part of human nature. And by the way, they're privileged, they're used to it. And if we don't trust them to lead things, everything will fall to wreck. And that Babel exactly, the Tower of Babel exactly, that is it. And yeah, so Nimrod and all that sort of stuff. There was a time before all of that, when Adam dwelled and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, which is an old British anarchist saying. There was a time before the gentry, and in the Garden of Eden, and indeed shortly afterwards, there was no gentry. Live with it, you upper class buggers. No, there wasn't. I just think that's a bit of a. We went through a dream for a while, and for some people, it was a beautiful dream of heraldry and knights in armor. For other people, it was a nightmare of oppression and clashing armies. But it was a phase. It wasn't everything. And I'm not saying we don't have elites now. We do, and they're just as bad as the previous ones. In fact, some of them are the previous ones. Look at the British aristocracy that seem to be the major shareholders in all these global companies. So, it hasn't changed that much. But, I suspect we've got to remember there actually was a time before all that was prevalent. And you reminded me of why I wanted to bring Heidegger up. Because, of course, his great masterpiece, and I actually do think it is, Sein und Zeit, being and time. We are beings of a particular time. I think that is incredibly important. I didn't in the past, I confess that. We're all the sons and daughters of God. We're all immortal spirits. We're bound for heaven and glory in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. However, there is an earthly aspect to us, and that is coloured very much by time. Would it make sense for any of us, real sense, to go back into the Elizabethan period and start talking about what we knew from our perspective? I mean, number one, they'd think we were mad. And secondly, there would be a conceptual clash on such a level. I mean, no, let's transport a battleship back to the court of Henry VIII. I mean, I'm like you. I think I'm much more ambivalent about Henry VIII. He seemed to be, I don't know, British folklore. Even when the Church of England has turned up so he could get his dodgy divorce, he's moaning and moaning about being a Roman Catholic. Look, are you a Roman Catholic or not, mate? Just make your mind up. If you are, say sorry. Stop moaning and moaning and moaning about it. That's British folklore. It seems to be true to a certain extent. So I never know what I think about Henry VIII, apart from the fact he was a dictatorial tyrant. Yeah, I mean, we are creatures of our time. That isn't a limitation. Dear friends of mine at Westminster, who better remain nameless, don't like that book. I mean, for some people, being in time, it's become nearly a religious document, which clearly it isn't, and clearly it wasn't intended to be. I mean, Heidegger says that as a modern, he can write to the border, I'm paraphrasing, the borderlands of theology, but he can't really discuss theological concepts. For God's sake, man, you've just written a book about how you can't discuss it. Just bloody write a book discussing it. It's really easy. You might be wrong. There we are. We all might be wrong about certain things. Just get on with it. Have a bit of guts. But, I still think it's an incredibly significant book. It talks about mass culture from a period before that had happened. It talks about the reduction of the human condition to mere commodities and commodification, which, of course, is happening now across the board. I remember an advert from years ago where there was a young lady showing her silk stockings to somebody, and I can't remember the make of the stockings, so forgive me, whatever corporation came up with it, I can't remember. And the guy, is looking at her over dinner, and he says, "Oh, are they yada 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 stockings?" And she has this knowing smile. So, in other words, the stockings are much more important than the woman he's dating. For God's sake, this is awful. But we were warned about all of that in Heidegger. He saw it coming way before it actually turned up. And deeper thoughts on the hinterland of theology, on the edges of theology, like we can't really understand theology unless we embrace our time. And it's not saying be ignorant of the past and don't speculate about the future, but realize the incredible profundity of the time we live in ourselves. And what he wouldn't have said, the fact that that is possibly the key to understanding the kingdom. It's possibly our own key to unlocking scripture in the most relevant form for us in our particular time. I remember thinking that is very, very significant. I rather like people like Paul Tillich. I know the Southern Baptists don't. There was some rude scholar in the Southern Baptist movement years back who said, what was it? Tillich. Oh, yes, some sort of pantheist. Listen, he's a very important Christian theologian. Just take it on the chin. He disagrees with you. There we are. But I think we got to remember, I think in many ways, the significance of people like Steiner is when they discuss time, our relationship to time, and the fact we're all time spirits. But my trouble again with not people like you is when it goes into a wider circle of discourse. I mean, if I remember, I gave you that story. Was it last week or the week before about incredibly dud meetings I've been to at the Theosophical Society, which never actually get off the ground? Somebody says something, and then it's 20 minutes of everybody trying to chip in, saying what they think about something before the lecture's actually begun. Well, I'm sorry, Reg. Ken needs to say something here. He read a book on that 50 years ago, and that's how it just goes on and on and on. So I suppose when I'm talking to you and when our listeners are listening to you talking about the significance of time and time spirits, yeah, that's good. But what about the step down from there, where they've half read a book, they haven't bothered giving it enough time to actually think about what it might mean, and then they just sort of think that they're slaves of the temporal process, and who know, oh God, I'm so, no. I'll tell you the best one. Then I'll hand back. I went to a meeting about the Cathars a couple of years ago at the Theosophical Society in London, Gloucester Place. Yes, I loved every minute of it. There's a huge statue of Buddha at the bottom of the staircase. They've got this gorgeous staircase. I nearly went stump over wicket. I hadn't noticed this huge statue of Buddha. I'm sorry. Why do they put it under your feet? So I nearly fell over the top of Buddha, which embarrassing moments of our time. And then we got into the lecture room. There was no tea. There was no coffee. Somebody had forgotten to buy the biscuits. We all got into the room, and somebody said, "Cathars, I quite like them." And, oh, for God's sake! So that's the level of this meeting, then, is it? And that's what worries me about learned societies and golden concepts. The minute people aren't struggling with them in a meaningful way. Because I suspect you end up with dull remarks about Tillich and dull remarks about other types of Christian, and you're not really living your own Christianity. You just think you are. I'll hand back before I hang myself, I think. Handing back to you.
Well, yeah. I mean, what does he say? He says, "My Father's house has many mansions." And so, consequently, I haven't said that yet. Consequently, everybody by their own nature determines which room in his Father's house you dwell. And it's a unique concept of spiritual science that freedom is the central modality. Because if it's different, your relationship to Christ is different if you come to him of your own free will and accord. And so that in and of itself is a very profound concept. But I have made mention on several occasions of Hegel's comments on the multidimensionality of Scripture, and I managed to dig up the actual quotation from Hegel. And he says, "The deepest thought is united with the figure of Christ, with the historical and outer one. And that's the great thing about the Christian religion, that for all of its profundity, it's easy to understand it in an outer way. And yet it challenges one to get into it more deeply. Thus, it's for every stage of development and also satisfies the highest demands, end quote. And so I was able to find that in Rudolf Steiner quoting it in an esoteric lesson from 1903 or 1904 from his to his esoteric students. And so in looking at that, and that's exactly what you're articulating, and you're not going to find any one place where you're going to be able to get all facets of the dynamic. And the challenge is to be able to be tolerant of other people, isn't it? Whatever you do to the least of them, you do unto me. And so you see Christ, and he's the great example, and yet who's he hanging out with? He's hanging out with people from the wrong side of the track. You know, he's hanging out with the so-called lower elements of society. You know, with the criminality and all of that is said to exist, but he loves them, and that's the difficult thing for people to understand, because love as a human faculty has developed gradually, and it arose ultimately. It finds its source in self-love, and so you have your love for your family and kith and kin, your nation group, and to be able to get to where it's a universal is the challenge, and that's the challenge of the modern age, is to be able to enter into a conscious relationship with what it means to be a universal human being, and that's the ultimate tolerance that expresses itself in a willingness to allow other people to be wrong, and also to expect your own right to be wrong. And if you don't have that principle involved, then what you've done is you've created, shall we say, an ineffectual vehicle to be able to come to terms with the quest for truth, because the scientific method, it's always a work in progress. There's never any finality, like, aha, we finally found the answer. I mean, there are certain basic things that you can find within the realms of science that are repeatable and have been demonstrated. And yes, of course, there is that, but ultimately it gets down to the challenge of being able to, I'm trying to dig something up here, and the computer's a little slow because we're doing so much data. But here's John Stuart Mill. He says, persons of genius, it is true, are always likely to be a small minority. But in order to have them, it is necessary to preserve the soil in which they grow. And so you have your utilitarian of note. We've made mention to him so many times here, because there's a group of 3 individuals that were found by Harvard to be the 3 highest IQs historically that they were able to calculate. And this was through examining the lives and careers of literally thousands of people. And they came up with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the German, John Stuart Mill, who happens to be British. And then you have, of course, Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swede, who David has written a book that covers certain facets of his career. So you look at this grouping of 3, and as I've made mention before, 2 out of 3 are occultists. I mean, that's kind of an interesting thing. If the study of esotericism is so benighted, why is it that 2 of the 3 of the smartest people pursued it. And so you see that there's that whole idea that they both have a conscious relationship, developing a bridge to the spiritual world as a source of inspiration, and to not limit themselves entirely to the realm of the senses. Whereas John Stuart Mill himself, he's an interesting character because he is dealing with the most developed intellectual, conceptual utilitarian, and trying to find the viable path, the most effectual path. That's the basis of utilitarianism that leads back to Jeremy Bentham, who we know at University College London is on display as mummified remains. And so that gives you some idea of what that's about. But he was literally a mentor through his John Stuart Mill's father. And his father was a formidable individual who educated John Stuart Mill in all aspects of science and languages, and he turned him into one of the most dynamic scholars. But you see, through John Stuart Mill's development, he did develop a formidable force of conscience. So within his view of the world, even though it is this analytical path, nonetheless, the sounding board for his analysis was his heart. So that you can't see him as one of these heartless intellectual types. You see him because, for example, he became a champion of the rights of women, for example. That it only made sense to him that they would have a voice in the workings of society at large. And so it's interesting to follow his career, and in looking at his book on liberty, it's a marvelous exercise in thought to be able to follow the organic way in which he connects one idea to another. And so in pursuing any of these people, or like you make reference to Martin Heidegger, I mean, nonetheless, yeah, he's dodgy. He's like you say, a member of the Nazi Party, but you couldn't get anywhere in German culture at that time if you weren't a member. But that being said, he did become like a philosophical underpinning of the ideology of the party itself, and which is interesting and in and of itself. And it's some of the most tightly wound writings you're going to find, and it also shares that German proclivity that in order for something to be true, it has to be poetic. So it's beautifully written. And that being said, I prefer Goethe, and I look to the failure on the Germans to be able to take up effectively the Goethean understanding of metamorphosis. That meets that construct of being in time most effectively, because if you keep following being in time, you get to an almost nonlinear vantage point, which is interesting because, in essence, that's true. But in getting to what, like our Buckminster Fuller pointed out, he talked about a radiant, nonlinear epistemology. That was his worldview, which is very much saying, well, you're living in a hologram, it's only a movie, which is actually fits in with the Hindu concept of Maya, and also fits in with the principles of spiritual science. It's that it's an illusion to think that you're separate from yourself when you were alive, say, in ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia, and that those faculties are still a part of your being, the previous incarnations that you have. It's just that you have not been able to access them with as thorough facility as somebody who's been through initiation and has developed this conscious relationship to his vehicles. because the first step in the path is to be able to articulate your I am or true ego into your astral body by being able to control the domination of the sympathies and antipathies of the astral body. And through that, it becomes transformed into the spirit self, or what's called in yogic and Eastern philosophy, manas, which is the higher mind. And then further down the path would be bringing the ego into a conscious relationship with the body of etheric formative forces of memory and habits. And this takes much more development. And that would be, in the East, considered somebody who was working on that stage would be considered a chela, or a higher student. And of course, mastery leads to that develops into your life spirit, okay, which is the principle of Buddhi, Budhi, which is what's being made reference to with the name of the Gautama Buddha, is that he has Buddhi. He's been able to be awakened in that realm. And then when you take it, the next step is the spirit man, and that's where you come into a relationship with the Atma, or the father principle within your being, which of course is highly exalted, has to do with the first stage, old Saturn, and the development of the primal physical, which is embodied in the warmth. And so when one brings oneself into relationship to the warmth of their being that's carried in the blood, that's your sacred self. And that's why you don't want people sticking stuff in your blood if you can avoid it. That's, as Mephistopheles says in Faust, blood is a very singular fluid. And that's why they always say the devil wants you to sign your name in blood, because you're giving him access to the most intimate realm of your being, which is your individual nature, as received through the agency of the workings of the Spirit of Christ that manifested in Jesus Christ. So that's a very sacred thing. And so, in looking back at some of the themes that you got into, I find it interesting that King Arthur, he pulled the sword out of the stone, right? And you get into the idea of the British folk soul is tied into that mineral realm. Widow Steiner talks about the British folk soul is very much into the mineral aspect, whereas the myth of the lady in the lake with the sword, that's kind of hearkening to the French, right? Because their destiny of their folk soul, their mythos, ties into the marriage of a water spirit. And so you have this whole idea, which is an ancient Celtic thing, because the Celtic shrines had wells. There was the spirits of the wells, and it was the maidens of the well that were so significant in that French stream. And so you have this whole kind of Myrmidian realm of the watery spirit. And so it's interesting to enter into the mythos of some of these things, just as something to live with artistically. These are not belief systems. These are what you would call ways of engaging imagination, and ways of engaging inspiration and intuition, so that the more one exercises a faculty, the more developmental it becomes. And Widow Steiner makes the point that you have to have in your education early in life certain riddles that are brought forward through fairy tales, myths, legends, and so forth, sagas, that you don't know the answer to, so that you can grow into the answer. That's the development itself, is that you have to have something that provides a vehicle for future development. And that was what was so engaging about the relationship of Goethe to the Freemasonic stream, as he saw it as a means or a frame to be able to garner an archetypal relationship to his personal development. And like I've said before, in his home, that there was actually these vignettes of stages in his life. There's 12 paintings that he had inserted into the walls of zodiacal dramas in his own personal life, so that he lived with this thematic type of thinking that was so central, as did Emanuel Swedenborg. As far as the John Stuart Mill, I don't have any information regarding that side of his personality.
I promise to keep it brief because I have noticed the time, don't worry. Oh, right, I've got to mention something about a sort of phenomenon that's happening in Britain at the minute. Everyone's got to go and watch the saga of Jackie Weaver. If you want to know about the British folk soul, you've just got to go and look at this bun fight that was recorded in a local parish council about somebody, this ridiculous row about nothing. That's the British folk soul, okay? So if you want to have a deep insight into the British folk soul, I put something on my Facebook page, but there are other things out there too. She's become a national hero because she threw out the chair of the meeting because he was being rude and she thought he was being misogynistic. But she probably was. The minute you're outside of large industrial or large civilized hubs in Britain, it gets pretty basic. So have a look at, is that mineral? It probably is. Yeah, go and have a look at that. I'm worried that people tend to forget far too easily that this is a united kingdom. I mean, we've got Welsh, we've got Irish, we've got Scottish, as well as as well as English. I mean, in many ways, the outlooks, at essence, the spirituality is very, very different. An example being, to an Englishman, an education is to get a job. Whereas if you say to an Irish guy, I'm thinking Northern Ireland at the minute, that education was only for that, they think you're a total barbarian. And even the guy sweeping the streets is expected to be able to know a thing or two. What poets do you know? That would never cross an Englishman's mind. What's the point of poetry anyway? So, we've got to remember, is there such a thing as a British folk soul? I'm skeptical of that. Because, I mean, let's take the Cornish. They're stubborn and ignorant, and who wants to talk to them? So, is that an example? Is that an example of a British folk soul? I think it might go deeper than that. We might need some ethereal pincers or an incision to be made here and there by an astral scalpel. I suspect there is, but there isn't. There is, but there isn't. I mean, if you look at proud Celts, like the Welsh and the Irish, compared to of Norse Scotland, of course, people forget a lot of them are of Viking descent, which is not English. The English are Anglo-Saxons. If you dig deeply, there isn't the level of mineral consciousness that I would love to say exists. But having said that, make your own minds up. Go and look at the Jackie Weaver material. It is mind-blowing. Certainly Swedenborg didn't think much of reincarnation, or at least he didn't discuss it much. I mean, certainly he can't rule it out in principle because there are recurring figures in Holy Scripture itself. My reading of that is that he wasn't really interested in looking at those supernal processes. I mean, he was map making. He was map making in the other world. So if you're involved in cartography, you're probably not looking at other types of process. Certainly a sizable percentage of the early Christian church did believe in reincarnation. I've got a load of people, chums of mine at the minute in this part of the world, who are studying ancient Christianity and its relationship to notions of reincarnation. Some of them go a little too far to my mind and claim all Christians thought that. I can't imagine any time frame, since we're talking about time spirits, where any group of people, they've all thought the same thing. There's bound to be some bugger at the back that disagrees. So maybe nearly all, but certainly not all, but certainly it was a massively important thought for the early Christian church, and for various reasons the hierarchies didn't like the idea of reincarnation. They didn't like it being discussed. And maybe it's time for Christian reincarnation to make a reprise, because it links in with other facets of the early church that make people nowadays uncomfortable. A sizable percentage were universalists. Everyone will be saved, not immediately, but at some point. That to me sounds like that's linked to the reincarnation view somehow. And then you get people saying, Calvin wouldn't have said that, or Luther wouldn't have said that. Well, no, they wouldn't have done. But the point is, the early Christians, who must have known something about it, they would have done. And that doesn't mean it's the end of the story, but it does mean it's an important discussion. One last thing before I hand back to you. Now, I'm getting worried about the time too, John. Search the scriptures daily, because I think if you do that, then you understand the Steiners and the Swedenborgs a lot more effectively, because I'm absolutely convinced they did. And all of a sudden, you've got this added artillery to help you understand the Christian vocation. Handing back to you, John.
Yes. Well, again, trying to garner an image of that mineral capacity of the British folk soul. Have to keep in mind that Rudolf Steiner is very clear when he talks about that the qualities, the qualitative aspect of the folk soul is geographical, and it has to do with dwelling in the place where you live. It's not a racial thing. And so he does make the point about how people, when they migrate to America, they change through the generations to become more and more American in their expression. So that's a key point to unlock some of that. That being said, those of you that would like to buy Reverend David or myself a cup of coffee or something in consideration of our efforts here, our humble efforts, you can go through the links below that will show you as paypal.me / John Barnwell 888 and paypal.me / D Parry, Parry 777. And it's greatly appreciated, the people that have been generous in the past, and also for people that have acquired our books. It's very helpful in this humble endeavor of ours. Somebody just bought one of your books just the other day, I saw. They said that they had just ordered it. And so that's a good thing. But as always is the case, and I don't know if David's exhausted his inexhaustible store of wisdom so far, but as we're drawing to the close, I always like that to give Reverend David an opportunity to kind of consecrate our little endeavor here, and with some form of prayer.
Two things. You know me, there are always two things. I can't imagine undertaking a project like this with anyone else. It has to be you. For all sorts of reasons, it has to be you. Secondly, this leads into the prayer. I mean, when I went to university late, and when I went to university, I wanted to look at all the objections to Christianity. So I actually studied Hinduism and Buddhism as well as Christian theology. And I read the classic atheists, not every single one of them, but the majority of them. And I've got something to share with everyone. Don't be afraid. Christianity is Christianity, and it leads towards the transcendent truth. Don't be afraid. That's what I learned. And let's remember not to be afraid in our spiritual lives each day. because everything is a gift. We wake up in the morning and that's a gift. If we had food on our table, that's a gift. The air that we breathe is a gift. The relationships we have, no matter how challenging, are actually gifts. There is nothing that isn't given to us. We are receivers of the greatest possible blessing in this universe, conscious, sentient, and loving life. And that is the core of the Christian message and the core of the Christian mystery. May each one of you be blessed and strengthened in that awakening to your dependency and your subsequent freedom. In Jesus Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Well, as always, thank you so much, my dear brother. And thanks everybody for showing up and for all the people that are catching us later on. There are links below the Facebook and the YouTube broadcast, so that if you want to examine any of those links, they're down there for your perusal. And if you could, I never think to do this, but if you click like or subscribe or something like that on the YouTube version, apparently that's supposed to help. And so that being said, I don't want to be too much of a Luddite, but thank you everybody for showing up.